The crimson sun of June 3, 1942, now cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's mighty fleet carved through the dark waters toward their destiny. For aircraft carriers Akagi Kagasoryu, and here formed the steel heart of the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled. Their flight decks bristling with over 270 warplanes that had brought the American Pacific Fleet to its knees at Pearl Harbor just 6 months prior. Commander Mitsuo Fukita stood on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, watching his pilots prepare for what Imperial headquarters promised would be the decisive blow against American naval power. The morning air carried the scent of aviation fuel and the metallic temps of ordnance as mechanics loaded armor-piercing bombs beneath the bellies of Aichi dive bombers. These same aircraft had rained destruction upon Battleship Row, and now they would finish what December 7th had started. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, studied intelligence reports with growing confidence. American naval strength in the Pacific had been crippled at Pearl Harbor, and their remaining forces scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Honolulu, would fall within hours of the first attack wave. From there, Japanese bombers would be within striking distance of Hawaii itself. The plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. While Nagumo's carrier force pounded Midway into submission, Admiral Yamamoto's main battle fleet would position itself to intercept and destroy any American naval forces foolish enough to respond. The remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet would be crushed between two hammer blows, opening the Pacific to complete Japanese domination, as referenced in Walter Lord's authoritative account, Incredible Victory. Yamamoto believed this operation would force America to seek a negotiated peace, recognizing Japan's supremacy in the Pacific theater. But intelligence failures had already begun to plague the operation. Japanese submarines, positioned to provide early warning of American fleet movements, had arrived too late to detect the departure of American naval forces from Pearl Harbor. Radio intercepts suggested increased American activity, but Japanese commanders dismissed these as routine defensive preparations. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the carrier Soryu reviewed his flight schedules one final time. Unaware that American codebreakers had penetrated the Japanese naval cipher weeks earlier, every movement of his task force, every radio transmission, every tactical decision had been monitored and analyzed by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort's intelligence team in the basement of the Pearl Harbor Administration Building, the pre-dawn hours of June 4th brought a deceptive calm to the Pacific. Maintenance crews swarmed over aircraft on all 4 carriers, conducting final inspections and arming procedures. Pilots gathered in ready rooms for final briefings, their faces showing the quiet confidence born of 6 months of unbroken victory. They had conquered the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and Burma. Midway would be merely another milestone on the road to total victory, Admiral. Nagumo ordered the first attack wave launched at 4:30 in the morning. 100. In 8 aircraft, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers roared off the wooden flight decks and formed up in the darkness. Their target lay 240 miles to the northeast. 2 small islands that would soon witness the beginning of Japan's most catastrophic naval defeat. As the first rays of June 4th illuminated the Pacific, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's recent raid on Tokyo had awakened the Japanese high command to America's growing capability for long-range strikes. The symbolic bombing of the Japanese homeland had stung imperial pride and convinced Yamamoto that Midway must be taken to prevent future attacks on the sacred soil of Japan. Commander Ginda Minoru, principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had expressed reservations about the complex battle plan, but his concerns were swept aside by the momentum of conquest. The Japanese Navy had not suffered a significant defeat in over 3 centuries, and confidence bordered on arrogance throughout. The fleet, aboard the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, a different mood prevailed. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, studied reconnaissance reports with methodical precision. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, Spruance knew exactly where the enemy fleet was positioned, thanks to the tireless work of Station Hypo's codebreakers who had cracked the Japanese J-UN-25 cipher, the Yorktown. Hastily repaired after suffering severe damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, carried the flag of Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. Her flight deck bore visible scars from Japanese bombs, and her hull still showed evidence of emergency repairs that should have taken months to complete. Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers had accomplished a miracle, returning her to combat readiness. In just 72 hours, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gathered his Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the Hornet. Knowing that his obsolete Douglas Devastator, torpedo bombers faced almost certain annihilation against Japanese fighter defenses. The squadron's newest pilot, Ensign George Gay, barely out of flight training, listened intently as Waldron outlined their desperate mission with characteristic bluntness.
We're going in low and slow,"
Waldron told his men, his weathered face. Betraying no emotion, Japs will be waiting for us with everything they've got. Some of us won't be coming back. But we're going to put our fish in the water and give those dive bombers the opening they need. On Midway itself, Colonel Shannon's Marine aircraft prepared for the inevitable assault. Outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters and ancient Vindicator dive bombers represented America's frontline defense. Aircraft that would have been relegated to training roles under normal circumstances, but these were far from normal circumstances. And every available machine would be thrown into the desperate defense of the atoll Captain Richard Fleming. Commanding Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 inspected his aging aircraft with grim determination. The Vindicators, nicknamed wind indicators by their crews for their poor performance, would be asked to accomplish what faster, more modern aircraft might struggle to achieve as morning approached. Radar operators on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike force at 5:53 a.m. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny garrison as every available fighter scrambled to intercept the attackers. Major Floyd Parks led 25 Marine fighters into the brightening sky. Knowing that his Buffalo fighters were outclassed by the legendary Mitsubishi Zero in every performance category except sheer courage, the first engagement began at 6:16 a.m. as Marine fighters tore into the Japanese formation. Lieutenant Clayton Canfield's Buffalo exploded under the guns of Lieutenant Saburo Shindo Zero, the first of many American aircraft that would fall that morning. But the Marines sold their lives dearly, disrupting Japanese attack formations, and forcing many bombers to release their ordnance prematurely, according to Samuel Eliot Morrison's Definitive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II. The Marine fighter defense, though ultimately unsuccessful, significantly reduced the effectiveness of the Japanese attack on Midway's installations. Captain Joichi Tomonaga, leading the first Japanese strike wave, surveyed the damage to Midway's facilities through his binoculars as his aircraft circled overhead. While significant destruction had been achieved, the airfield remained operational, and American aircraft continued to launch counterattacks. He radioed back to Admiral Nagumo at 7 a.m. with a message that would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack wave. Admiral Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his naval career as Tomonaga's message crackled through the radio at 7 a.m. on June 4th. The second wave of aircraft aboard his 4 carriers had been armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship operations, prepared to destroy any American naval forces that might appear. But Tomonaga's assessment suggested Midway required another devastating blow before it could be considered neutralized. The decision to rearm the second wave with land attack bombs would consume precious time and leave the carriers vulnerable during the changeover process. Mechanics and ordnance crews swarmed across the hangar decks of Akagi, Kagasoryu, and Hiryu, removing heavy torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs while wheeling high-explosive ordnance into position beneath waiting aircraft at 7:28 a.m. Lookouts aboard the cruiser Tone reported American aircraft approaching from the southeast. Lieutenant Tomonaga's strike force, turning from Midway with fuel running dangerously low, began landing operations even as enemy bombers pressed their attack against the Japanese fleet. Captain Richard Fleming led 6 Marine Vindicator dive bombers in a desperate assault against the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Their obsolete aircraft, struggling to penetrate the intense anti-aircraft fire that rose from every Japanese vessel. Fleming's Vindicator, riddled with shrapnel, continued its attack run even as flames engulfed the cockpit. His bomb struck Makuma's after turret, the explosion marking the first successful American attack against Yamamoto's fleet. The chaos intensified at 7:45 a.m. when a reconnaissance aircraft from the cruiser Tone reported 10 enemy surface ships bearing 20 degrees north, distance 240 miles. The report sent shockwaves through Nagumo's command. Staff American naval forces were approaching Midway, exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had hoped. But at the worst possible moment, Commander Jinda urged immediate launch of the rearmed second wave against Midway, arguing that the American ships posed no immediate threat. But at 8 a.m., a follow-up report changed everything. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carriers. The Americans had managed to position a carrier task force within striking distance of Nagumo's fleet, and Japanese aircraft were scattered between landing operations and rearming procedures. Nagumo ordered another reversal of arming procedures. The high-explosive bombs that had been loaded for the second Midway strike were hastily removed and replaced once again with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship operations. Aviation fuel lines snaked across hangar decks as mechanics rushed to complete the changeover, creating a volatile environment that would soon prove catastrophic. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 appeared on the horizon. At 9:20 a.m., their 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers approaching in a low-level attack that drew every Japanese fighter in the area. The obsolete American aircraft, designed in the early 1930s, struggled to maintain formation as Zeros dove upon them like hawks attacking sparrows. Waldron's voice crackled over the radio, "Attack immediately. Good luck, boys." His torpedo bomber disappeared in a ball of orange flame as Lieutenant Saburo Shindo's Zero raked it with cannon fire. One by one, the Devastators fell into the Pacific, their crews dying in the cold waters 2 miles below the Japanese fleet. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in his life jacket and watched in horror as his squadron mates perished around him. But their sacrifice had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. As Lieutenant Commander Wade, McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise approached their attack positions, as referenced in Gordon Prange's comprehensive study Miracle at Midway. The timing of the American attacks created a perfect storm of vulnerability for the Japanese carriers, with aircraft rearming operations leaving bombs, torpedoes, and aviation fuel exposed throughout their hangar decks. At 9:25 a.m., McCluskey spotted the distinctive wakes of Japanese carriers through broken cloud cover. Below him, the most powerful aircraft carriers in the Imperial Navy continued recovery operations, their flight decks crowded with aircraft and their hangar decks filled with ordnance and fuel. The moment that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War had arrived. At exactly 10:22 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, the Pacific War reached its decisive moment as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey rolled his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree attack dive against the Japanese carrier Kaga. The massive carrier, her flight deck crowded with aircraft preparing for launch, presented a perfect target for the American dive bombers that had materialized from the clouds like avenging angels. McCluskey's 1,000-pound McCluskey's flight deck near the island's superstructure, the explosion detonating aviation fuel, an ordnance that had been carelessly stored during the frantic rearming operations. Secondary explosions rippled across the carrier's length as Lieutenant Commander Richard Best led his section against the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's command ship, and the most prestigious carrier in the Imperial Navy, Commander Mitsuo Fukita, the Pearl Harbor attack leader who was recovering from appendicitis in Akagi's sick bay, felt the entire ship shudder as Best's bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar area. Torpedo warheads and bomb magazines detonated in a chain reaction that turned the carrier's interior into a blazing inferno. Within minutes, the ship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor was transformed into a floating crematorium. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown screamed down upon the carrier Soryu. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood calmly on his bridge as American bombs found their mark, igniting the same volatile mixture of fuel and ordnance that was consuming his sister ships. 3 direct hits turned Soryu into a raging pyre, her flight deck buckling under the intense heat as aviation. Fuel fed the flames that would claim over 700 lives. The attack lasted only 6 minutes, but in that brief span, 3 of Japan's foremost powerful aircraft carriers were reduced to burning hulks. The cream of Japanese naval aviation pilots who had trained for years and possessed irreplaceable combat experience perished in the flames or faced the terrible choice between burning alive and leaping into the Pacific. Admiral Nagumo, his face blackened by smoke and his uniform singed by flying debris, transferred his flag from the dying Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara. The admiral who had commanded the Pearl Harbor attack force now watched helplessly as his carriers burned against the afternoon sky. Their death throes, visible from 50 miles away, Captain Yanagimoto chose to go down with Soryu, lashing himself to the bridge as his ship settled deeper into the Pacific. His final radio transmission to the surviving ships of his division was a traditional death poem. Cherry blossoms fall, but the tree endures. The Emperor's navy shall rise again. The carrier disappeared beneath the waves at 7:13 p.m. Taking its captain and most of its crew to their deaths, only the carrier Hiryu remained operational. Her captain Tomio Kaku determined to exact revenge for his fallen comrades. At 1:30 p.m., 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, on a mission that would test American damage control capabilities to their limits. The Japanese strike found Yorktown already bearing scars from the Coral Sea battle and pressed home their attack with suicidal determination. 3 bombs struck the American carrier, one penetrating deep into her engineering spaces and extinguishing fires in 5 of her 6 boilers. Yorktown slowed to a crawl, listing heavily to port as damage control parties fought to save their ship. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Astoria, watched as his damaged carrier struggled to remain afloat. But Yorktown's crew, trained in the hard school of Pacific combat, gradually brought their ship back to life. Within 2 hours, she was making 20 knots and recovering aircraft, her flight deck patched with steel plates and her fires extinguished. Through heroic effort, according to Craig Simmons, acclaimed the Battle of Midway, the Japanese attack on Yorktown demonstrated the superior damage control training of American naval personnel, a factor that would prove decisive throughout the Pacific campaign. At 2:45 p.m., Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led Hiryu's torpedo bombers in a second attack against the patched Yorktown. Flying an aircraft with a damaged fuel tank that left a trail of gasoline across the sky, Tominaga knew he would not survive the mission. His torpedoes found their mark, flooding Yorktown's engineering spaces and forcing her crew to abandon ship for the second time in one day, but Hiryu's triumph proved short-lived. At 5 p.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet located the last Japanese carrier and began their attack runs against the ship that had wounded Yorktown. Captain Kaku ordered every available fighter into the air, but American bombs found their target with devastating accuracy. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on June 4th, the carrier Hiryu stood alone against the gathering darkness, her flight deck scarred by bomb fragments and her hangar spaces echoing with the screams of wounded men. Captain Tomio Kaku, the last carrier commander in Admiral Nagumo's once mighty force, surveyed the carnage around his ship with the stoic acceptance of a samurai facing inevitable death. The afternoon attacks by Enterprise and Hornet dive bombers had left Hiryu mortally wounded, her flight deck ruptured and impassable, her elevators jammed, and fires raging through her aviation fuel storage areas. Yet Kaku refused to abandon his vessel, determined to inflict maximum damage on the American fleet before his ship joined her sister carriers on the bottom of the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Takashige Iguza, Japan's most experienced dive bomber leader, lay dying in the carrier's sickbay, his body riddled with shrapnel from the American attack. The pilot who had led bombing runs against HMS Hermes and USS Peary whispered final instructions to his surviving aircrew, urging them to continue the attack even as Hiryu settled deeper into the water. At 6 p.m., Rear Admiral Tomoe Yamaguchi, commander of Carrier Division 2, made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than order the evacuation of Hiryu, he chose to remain aboard his flagship, sending a final radio message to Admiral Yamamoto. "I alone am to blame for the loss of Hiryu and Soryu. I shall remain on board to the end and share the fate of my ships." The admiral's decision reflected the code of Bushido that had governed Japanese naval officers for centuries. To survive the destruction of one's command was considered a disgrace worse than death, and Yamaguchi's choice inspired his remaining crew to fight on despite hopeless circumstances. Captain Kaku ordered the flooding of Hiryu's forward magazines to prevent catastrophic explosions, while damage control parties struggled to contain the fires that threatened to consume the ship's remaining aviation fuel. The carrier's executive officer, Commander Kano Ito, supervised the lowering of wounded men into lifeboats, knowing that each minute delayed increased the risk of total structural collapse. As darkness fell across the Pacific, American search planes reported Hiryu dead. In the water, her fires visible for miles against the night sky. But Japanese destroyers Kazagumo and Yugumo moved alongside the dying carrier, their crews preparing for a final act of defiance that would demonstrate the sacrificial spirit of the Imperial Navy. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Admiral Yamaguchi appeared on Hiryu's flight deck for the last time, his sword at his side and his uniform immaculate despite the chaos around him. He had composed a death poem during the night, following the tradition of samurai warriors facing their final moments. "The moon over the four seas are brothers under heaven. Why then do the winds and waves rage so furiously?" Captain Kaku joined his admiral on the tilting flight deck, and together they saluted the emperor's portrait in the ship's shrine before returning to the bridge. At 4:10 a.m., destroyer Makigumo fired 2 torpedoes into Hiryu's hull, ensuring that Japan's last aircraft carrier at Midway would not fall into American hands as a prize of war. The massive explosion that followed illuminated the pre-dawn darkness for miles around. Hiryu's back broke with a sound like thunder, and the carrier that had launched the attacks on Pearl Harbor, Darwin and Ceylon, began her final plunge toward the ocean floor. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku went down with their ship, along with 416 officers and men who chose death over dishonor, as referenced in Mitsuo Butida's memoir Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. The loss of 4 fleet carriers, and their irreplaceable aircrew, marked the beginning of Japan's inevitable defeat in the Pacific War. Though few realized it at the time, Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in his life jacket throughout the night of June 4th, watching the distant fires that marked the funeral pyres of the Japanese fleet. Rescued by a Catalina flying boat at noon on June 5th, Gay carried with him the memory of America's most decisive naval victory and the sacrifice of his squadron mates, who had died to achieve it. The Battle of Midway had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 experienced naval personnel. American losses totaled 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 lives. But beyond the statistics lay a more profound truth. Japanese naval aviation had suffered a blow from which it would never recover. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the catastrophic news of his fleet's destruction aboard his flagship Yamato at 3 a.m. on June 5th. The radio reports arriving in fragmentary transmissions that gradually revealed the scope of the disaster. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned Japan's leaders that he could run wild for 6 months in the Pacific, now faced the consequences of his most ambitious gamble. The loss of 4 fleet carriers represented more than a tactical defeat. It marked the collapse of Japan's strategic initiative in the Pacific War. The Akagi, Kagasoryu, and Hiryu had required years to construct and decades to perfect their operational techniques. Their aircrew represented the finest products of Japan's rigorous training programs. Many veterans of the China War who possessed combat experience that could never be replaced. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, Yamamoto's chief of staff, studied the preliminary damage reports with mounting horror. Over 200 aircraft had been lost, along with their pilots, bombardiers, and gunners. The first air fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, had been effectively destroyed in a single morning's engagement. Commander Minoru Ginda, confined to his sickbed aboard Akagi during the battle, had been rescued from the burning carrier, but remained hospitalized with severe injuries. The tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack now contemplated the strategic implications of Midway's failure. Without carrier-based aviation, Japan's island conquests became isolated outposts, vulnerable to American counterattack. The immediate priority was concealing the disaster from both the Japanese public and potential enemies. Yamamoto ordered a complete news blackout regarding the battle's outcome, classifying all information about carrier losses as state secrets punishable by death. Surviving aircrew were quarantined upon their return to Japan, forbidden to discuss their experiences even with family members. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga had led the second attack wave from Hiryu before perishing when his damaged aircraft ran out of fuel, became one of the battle's most celebrated heroes in official Japanese accounts. His final radio transmission, and making torpedo run, "Do not wait for my return," epitomized the sacrificial spirit that Japanese propaganda would emphasize while ignoring the strategic failure that made such sacrifices necessary. The cover-up extended to the families of the dead. Parents and wives of carrier aircrew received standardized condolence letters stating that their loved ones had died gloriously in action against the enemy, but providing no details about location or circumstances. The Imperial Navy's personnel bureaus created elaborate fictional accounts of training accidents and routine patrols to explain the sudden disappearance of entire squadrons. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American pursuit of Japanese survivors, demonstrated the methodical approach that would characterize his future campaigns. Rather than charging headlong after the retreating enemy fleet, he conserved his forces and maintained his position to cover Midway. Recognizing that preserving American strength was more important than pursuing a beaten foe, the rescue of Yorktown's crew provided a dramatic counterpoint to Japanese losses. Although the carrier had been abandoned twice and was being towed toward Pearl Harbor when the submarine 1-168 delivered the final torpedo blow on June 7th, over 2,000 of her crew survived the battle. American damage control techniques and rescue procedures had saved lives that would have been lost aboard Japanese ships. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, Yorktown's commanding officer, supervised the evacuation of his ship with the same professional competence that had brought her back from near destruction at Coral Sea. His crew's discipline during the abandonment contrasted sharply with the chaos that had engulfed Japanese carriers when their aviation fuel ignited. As referenced in John Lundstrom's authoritative study, The First Team, American naval aviation had demonstrated tactical flexibility and technological innovation that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate, particularly in the areas of damage control and pilot rescue operations. The strategic consequences of Midway extended far beyond the immediate naval engagement. Japan's planned invasion of Fiji and Samoa was cancelled, removing the threat to Australian sea lanes. The assault on Port Moresby was postponed indefinitely, allowing Australian and American forces to strengthen their positions in New Guinea. Most significantly, the initiative in the Pacific War had passed to the United States. American industrial production was beginning to reach its full potential. With new Essex-class carriers already under construction and pilot training programs expanding rapidly, Japan, by contrast, would struggle to replace its carrier losses and could never again achieve the concentration of experienced naval aviation that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible. 3 months after the Battle of Midway, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, contemplating the strategic situation that had deteriorated beyond his worst nightmares. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in August, seizing Henderson Field and establishing their first major foothold in the Solomon Islands. The initiative that Japan had held since Pearl Harbor was now irretrievably lost. The Carrier Reconstruction Program hastily initiated after Midway, faced insurmountable obstacles that highlighted Japan's industrial limitations. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, survivors of the Coral Sea battle, remained in Japanese ports undergoing repairs and aircrew replacement that would take months to complete. New carriers like Hiryu and Junyo lacked the operational experience of their sunken predecessors, their crews trained in haste rather than with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized pre-war Japanese naval aviation. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, the Pearl Harbor attack leader who had narrowly survived Akagi's destruction, served as an instructor at the Naval War College, training replacement pilots who would never match the skill level of their predecessors. The veterans who had gained combat experience over China and during the opening months of the Pacific War were gone, their expertise buried beneath the waters of Midway, along with their aircraft. The human costs of the battle continued to reverberate. Through Japanese society, despite the government's censorship efforts, families in naval towns like Yokosuka and Kure began to notice the absence of familiar faces, the silence where once there had been the bustle of active air stations. Widows wore their mourning in secret, forbidden to acknowledge publicly the losses that had befallen the Imperial Navy's most elite units, American industrial capacity. Meanwhile, accelerated toward its wartime peak, the Essex-class carriers Independence and Bunker Hill were already conducting sea trials, their flight decks destined to carry the war to Japan's island fortresses. Pilot training programs that had been overwhelmed by the urgent need for replacements, after Pearl Harbor now produced aircrew in numbers that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's sacrifice at Midway had not been forgotten by his surviving comrades. The new Torpedo Squadron 8, equipped with modern Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers, trained relentlessly for the campaigns that would follow. The obsolete Douglas Devastators that had died so gallantly in the morning hours of June 4th were replaced by aircraft that could match Japanese fighters in speed and firepower. The strategic implications of Midway extended beyond the Pacific theater. Germany's submarine warfare in the Atlantic had reached its peak effectiveness, but American shipbuilding programs now allocated did resources to both theaters without the constraint of needing to maintain defensive positions in the Pacific. The Toshin Navy, that had been only a dream in 1940, was becoming reality by late 1940-2. Japanese naval construction priorities, by contrast, remained focused on battleships and cruisers that had proved irrelevant to modern naval warfare. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, products of pre-war strategic thinking, consumed resources that might have built additional carriers. The lesson of Midway that aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the decisive weapons of naval warfare was acknowledged but never fully internalized by Japanese planners. Emperor Hirohito, briefed privately on the true extent of Midway's losses, began to question the assumptions that had led Japan into war with the United States. The quick victory that had been promised by his military advisors was clearly impossible, and the nation's industrial capacity could not sustain a prolonged conflict against American production capabilities, as referenced in Herbert Bix's comprehensive biography Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan. The emperor's private doubts about ultimate victory began immediately after Midway, though he would not openly express these concerns for another 2 years. The Battle of Midway had lasted for days, but its consequences would echo throughout the remaining 3 years of the Pacific War. Japanese naval aviation, decimated in those crucial hours of June 4th, never again achieved the tactical excellence that had made Pearl Harbor possible. The carriers that had been floating symbols of Japanese naval power became, in their final moments, monuments to the strategic miscalculations that doomed the empire of the rising sun. Admiral Yamamoto's prophecy about running wild for 6 months had proved tragically accurate. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway marked the zenith of Japanese naval power. Everything that followed would be a fighting retreat toward inevitable defeat, punctuated by occasional tactical victories that could not alter the strategic reality that emerged from Midway's iron storm of fire. The carriers Akagi, Storyu, and Hiryu had indeed become floating tombs, their steel hulls now resting on the Pacific floor, alongside the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy. But their sacrifice had not been meaningless. It had revealed the limits of Japanese power and marked the beginning of America's long march toward victory in the Pacific War.